Alright, so, are Azure Lane and Kantai Collection good animes? The cut and dry answer is no. Both animes suffer from a lot of the same issues. Most of the character writing is one-dimensional. The fight scenes are really hard to care about. Both have no idea what to make their own stories. The music and voice acting are pretty good, but the animation used to depict it is rather inconsistent. For both anime, all of these problems, minus the animation one, come from the same point of origin, not knowing the direction the anime wanted to take. Both Azure Lane and Kantai Collection wanted to be a serious, character-centric story with the backdrop of warfare, and also wanted to be a light-hearted, wholesome fanservice experience for fans of the original games to enjoy. I'm not against the idea of combining these two concepts together, and there probably even is a successful adaptation anime with those ideas somewhere out there. But the reason why I enjoyed the Kantai Collection anime more than I did the Azure Lane anime comes down to familiarity with the source material, the games themselves. To state my credentials, if you want to call it that, I've been following Azure Lane for about a year and a half at the time of this video. I don't consider myself a super active player, but I still keep up to date with new events and characters and make sure the naval curry is topped off every day. On the other hand, I pretty much knew nothing about Kantai Collection before the anime, with my only pieces of prior knowledge being that Ken-Cole is a ship girl game and that Yudachi likes to say "Boy." I think there's an obvious response to my statement about familiarity. It would be, well, of course you would dislike a bad anime about something you know better more than something you don't, because you care more about the thing you know better. This response is totally valid, and I think definitely played a role in forming my opinion about the two animes. Because I started the video very negatively about the two animes, you might think that when I said that I liked Kantai Collection more, it was me picking the lesser of two bad animes, but that's not quite true. To the dismay of one of my friends, I think I enjoyed Ken-Cole more than I should have, and I am not entirely against suggesting Ken-Cole with a few heavy caveats to anyone that just wants a light, cute anime. The most important factor in my enjoyment of Kantai Collection was my unfamiliarity with the game itself. Because I knew nothing about the source material, I didn't have any preset expectations for any fights, fanservice, and most importantly, characters. Because I had no previous attachment to the game, any of Ken-Cole's mistakes and shortcomings had their blows softened for me in comparison to Azure Lane. I still have problems with the fights, the fanservice, and the characters, but I was still able to ultimately write off Ken-Cole as a cute little anime because my expectations for it were different versus those I had for Azure Lane. There is a second reason as to why I enjoyed the Ken-Cole anime more than the Azure Lane anime, but that requires getting into more details, so we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I wanted to start the video with a quick discussion on the impact of familiarity because I think the biases stemming from the impact will be clearly reflected in my review of both animes. From having reread the script a few times, I think that my review of Azure Lane will seem more harsh than that of Ken-Cole, although I'm hoping that it doesn't come off as unfair. That being said, I don't want to solely focus on the negatives of these animes. It's no hidden secret that these aren't great animes. We'll talk about the negatives for sure, but I think both Azure Lane and Ken-Cole had sparks of good ideas sprinkled throughout that never got to be entirely realized, especially in the case of Azure Lane. We'll focus on these once we get a little further into the video. I'm sure that most people watching this video will either have already seen one or both animes or don't ever plan on watching them, so the spoiler warning feels a little unnecessary, but here it is anyways. We're going to begin with Azure Lane. Azure Lane wanted to go big. I don't think ambitious is quite the right word, but Bibury, the studio behind the anime, certainly bit off more than it could chew. Azure Lane's story is built around 4 factions: Eagle Union and Royal Navy, who combine to form the Azure Lane, and the Sakura Empire and Ironblood, who combine to form the Red Axis. We can bump this number up to 5 if we want to count the Sirens as another faction. The story is that the factions of Azure Lane and Red Axis once worked together to fight against the Sirens, but eventually Red Axis turned against Azure Lane and began working together with the Sirens. I actually quite like the premise of the anime, but the main reason that this doesn't work out is because none of these factions end up being interesting in the long run. Eagle Union and Royal Navy blend into a singular faction that lacks an identity. Neither faction does anything to distinguish themselves from one another aside from their outfits, and Royal Navy occasionally drinking tea because they're supposed to be British. There's no real sub-stories that happen within the factions either, so Azure Lane becomes a bog-standard protagonist faction that isn't super compelling to watch. Ironblood just doesn't get enough representation or screen time to make anything of them. Bismarck, the Ironblood leader who is featured in the anime's opening, literally gets only one scene throughout the whole thing. Their entire faction is carried by Prince Eugen, pronounced Prince Eugen, and a tiny bit of Z23. The Sirens are in the same boat as Ironblood in terms of representation and screen time. The closest character to Eugen they have is Purifier, who I would have liked to see more of but hear less of. Both Ironblood and the Sirens have no clear identity aside from being bad guys, but at least they can kind of be excused because of their lack of major presence. The Sakura Empire is the best of the bunch, mostly because they're supposed to be the premier bad guys of the anime, although that is 99% Akagi. The Sakura Empire's identity in the anime is tied closely to Project Orochi, so seeing other characters do things that are not directly involved with Orochi makes it feel like the Sakura Empire actually has a little more depth to it compared to other factions who don't have real identities. That's not to say that the Sakura Empire has a great identity, it's just saying that they at least have an identity and a layer around it. When it comes to characters, the Azure Lane game has an absolute boatload of them, numbering in the hundreds. So how did that enormous roster translate into the anime? The anime really tried its best to fit in as many characters as possible. This is all great in terms of fanservice because it does provide maximum waifu coverage. Not that Dunkirk got in or Pennsylvania got a single line, but that's a discussion for another day. Salty opinions aside, a big problem emerges from this decision. It becomes extremely difficult to make anything meaningful out of all of the included characters. This leads to a weird juggling of trying to introduce as many ship girls as possible while also trying to write for ones that have already been introduced and are involved in the main story. In the end, none of it pays off. There are some characters that experience a degree of change such as Enterprise, Akagi, and Kaga, but these changes all feel like a few steps were skipped in the process. It's why I prefer one-note characters with no changes forced onto them over characters like Enterprise. My favorite examples would be Sheffield, Edinburgh, pronounced Edinburgh, and my favorite character in the whole anime, Shokaku. There's two main storylines present in the anime, one following Enterprise in Belfast as Belfast tries to get Enterprise to change her self-destructive ways, and another following Javelin, Laffy, Unicorn, and their magical quest for timeless friendship. The second storyline is fine in that it mostly turns into harmless, cute fanservice. The first story is something else though. Belfast's goal to change Enterprise works in a bit that NT does get less serious and relaxes a bit. This amounts to nothing meaningful though, as none of NT's decisions in the anime are impacted by this change. Furthermore, Enterprise and Belfast fill two roles and only fill those two roles. Enterprise is the powerful shipgirl protagonist who continues to battle even though she's been heavily damaged. Belfast is the loyal shipgirl maid who does anything for the well-being of her master, who for the purposes of the anime is Enterprise. Some arguments could be raised that NT progresses out of this role a bit thanks to Belfast's insistence, but Belfast herself remains painfully static. Anything she says that isn't maid related is quite generic and offers little to no insight into an actual character. On the side of minor nitpicks, war never changes regardless of era 10 times throughout the anime, 3 times in the first episode alone. The anime kind of has an idea of what to do with its story in the first 6 episodes. The light changes in Enterprise offer some semblance of character growth, and the Black Metal Cube is a decent enough catalyst to drive the story forward. It's not spectacular by any means, but still pretty passable. Everything past episode 6, however, goes on to show that this story was far from being complete. The episode 7 fight happens with no build-up or foreshadowing. It wouldn't be so bad if this fight wasn't the most important fight in the entire anime minus the final one, since the Black Mental Cube gets powered up and Enterprise shoots the shit out of Akagi. The idea of Orochi manipulating people like Akagi and Kaga through their memories and desires is great. I wanted to see more of it, but because Orochi became active so late, there just wasn't a real opportunity to explore this idea. Speaking of exploring ideas, there were also several smaller good ideas in the last bunch of episodes that never got to be developed on. The frozen purgatory realm where the siren ships malfunction, Amagi as a whole and her presence in Akagi and Kaga's relationship, the distrust against the first carrier division presented by Shokaku that eventually leads to tension between Kaga and Nagato over the delay of the Orochi project, potential Ironblood interference over the Orochi project. We'll talk more about these ideas later. To go into fights, the best one was in episode 1. While there's not too many important characters involved, the ones we do see are introduced decently enough. Unicorn's Unicorn and Kaga's Wolf were a pleasant surprise, and in hindsight I wish we got to see more of these kinds of scenes to spice things up. It's very obvious that there was much more time and effort poured into it compared to other episodes. On the other hand, I found a lot of the other fights in the anime to be really hard to care about. Aside from episodes 5 and 12, there's no real stakes tied to any of the fights. The anime also never sinks any ship girls either. I absolutely understand why they chose not to, but this in conjunction with no real stakes means that the fights don't have much weight to them. They are also messy and give me the feeling that they were just being made up as they went along, with the most notable examples being episode 4 and 7. 4 starts okay, but the ending with the bomb boat is a complete disaster. 7 once again starts okay, but the whole new purgatory dimension, while cool, is a very unnecessary flex by Enterprise. It seems like an attempt to make the fight feel more interesting. I think it succeeds in this visually, but only visually. I didn't find Berserk Enterprise to be that interesting to watch. The only other fight I want to mention is in episode 5. It's a shame that almost nothing actually happens during the fight. I was a big fan of the ruined island setting, and this episode was also the first instance of all 4 factions being at a single location. The actual ships firing their cannons isn't too interesting, but there was a lot more that could have been done with the ship girl fights themselves. It unfortunately ends up boiling down to a lot of dialogue and not a lot of action. On a positive note, the anime does use this opportunity to introduce a handful of new characters, and even though none of them turn out to be important, it works well here since all of the factions are present and it's not forced or out of context. The fights in general are also much more flashy compared to those in Kantai Collection. The fanservice in this anime falls anywhere between the usual and some more wacky stuff. Examples include the beach, the bathhouse, panty shots galore, family-friendly content, the bathhouse again, partially nude crab rave, and the tumultuous tale of torpedo bulges. If there's one thing to praise Azure Lane on, it's that the fanservice isn't too intrusive, for a lack of better words. The anime knows its timing well enough that the fanservice, both explicit and wholesome, doesn't ever severely interrupt any more serious scenes, something that Ken Cole struggles with. So that's Azure Lane. I know that what I've said on it so far has been quite negative. While my opinion on it isn't sky high, I should clarify that I don't dislike this anime. I appreciate a good number of things the anime wanted to do, and while the final product didn't quite make it, I don't consider it a failed attempt. Like I said earlier, I don't think Biberi was equipped with the experience or time to complete all of the goals they set out for this anime. After all, while the anime was airing, there was a 3-month delay before the final episodes came out, and the delay was announced before all hell broke loose in 2020. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned the idea that both the Azure Lane and Kantai Collection animes suffered from trying to be too serious and not very serious at the same time. I think Azure Lane tried to lean more towards being serious. It's reflected in the more diverse fights as well as some hints of political drama. If a serious Azure Lane anime was created with those aforementioned elements being properly explored, I unironically think we could have had a solid drama on our hands. Moving on to Kantai Collection, there's a stark difference between it and Azure Lane's anime. The scale is much smaller. The anime is much more heavily focused on the individual characters than the actual happenings around them. There's no tensions between various factions because now there's only one. There's no constant need to throw new characters at us because there's less of them in total and most of them are introduced in the first episode. It's even reflected in the more simple unified outfits of the Ken Cole ship girls that this is going to be a more down-to-earth anime. Whereas Azure Lane shot for a big target and didn't hit it, Ken Cole aimed at something smaller and came closer to its target. Let's begin with the story. Ken Cole's main story follows Fubuki, a special type destroyer, and her dream to fight alongside the much less intimidating looking version of Akagi. Right off the bat, it's a much smaller, more personalized story than Enterprises from Azure Lane. It's also a story with an actual beginning and an end compared to Enterprises, which has a pretty murky ending. Aside from meeting the basic qualifications of being a story, I like the approach the anime took where it never over-focuses on Fubuki to let other smaller storylines have their time, but it also makes sure to consistently progress the main story even if it is in small increments. It's still not a very planned out story since a lot of it is just Fubuki adoring Akagi and Akagi, I guess, noticing her performance in stories. At the very least, it is still a backbone for the anime to rely on. The bigger picture story of the war against the Abyssals, however, is a mess. The various operations that take place during the anime don't feel distinct enough from one another to feel like there's any meaningful progress in the war itself. There's no changes or consequences that happen as a result of the operations themselves either, besides the sinking of Kisaragi, more on that later, the sinking of some Abyssals, and everyone grows to like Fubuki. My main gripe with the war against the Abyssals is that the Abyssals are just not very good villains in the anime. They are essentially faceless and personalityless, besides evil faction doing evil things is evil for evil reasons. Not only do the Abyssals barely say anything, very little is said about them in terms of history or motivation outside of a tiny blurb at the start of episode 1. There's only ever a single instance of a recurring Abyssal, so there's even less reason to care about both them and the war against them. When it comes to characters, a lot of them can be summarized into a personification of a single quirk. Yudachi likes to say Oi! Hibiki likes to say Russian words, Sendai is a night owl, Naka is an idol, and so on. In a lot of cases, these quirks are used as a substitute for any unique traits, so many of the characters fail to go past the surface level. To be fair, the anime doesn't attempt too many big moments of character development outside of Fubuki, so it never stretches these caricatures beyond just being a caricature. I'm almost certain that this isn't an accurate representation of the characters' personalities from the Kantai Collection game itself. There's a few noteworthy semi-exceptions, those being characters that are still largely based on single quirks, but at least the quirks are entertaining to watch. These include Shimakaze, the Kongo sisters, and Yamato. Watching Kongo especially gave me the glimmer of an idea as to why someone bongo 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 didn't want to leave their Kongo. Conceptually, Yamato is really cool. I'm a big fan of the idea of a ship girl so powerful that I'm a big fan of the idea of a ship girl so powerful that has never seen battle because she just uses up too many resources to fight. It's a small shame that she essentially gets forced into a fight by the end of episode 8 and later into 12. I wish they gave her a more steady progression into joining the fight, but it's not the biggest deal. Fubuki is arguably the only proper character in the whole anime, but she doesn't quite escape the generic, energetic anime girl stereotype. That being said, I still found Fubuki to be really likable despite her genericness, if that's even a real word. Much like Azure Lane, the fights in Kankai are also just as hard to care about. Like I mentioned, Abyssals in the anime are just bad. And similar to Azure Lane, the fights are a lot of dialogue, but this time instead of it being banter thrown between enemies, it is the ship girls narrating their battle plans. I talked about how Azure Lane's fights struggle to always have a real set of stakes tied to them. Kankai doesn't even try. The reasons for the various operations happenings are reasons that the viewers have zero incentive to care about. Visually, pretty much all of the fights take place in the open ocean. It's not something I can really fault the anime for since it is about anime girls that are also warships, and warships just happen to fight in the ocean. It's just unfortunate that this is a big factor in why all of the fights feel so samey. The final fight of Operation MI is unfortunately the worst. There were a few cool ideas like the airfield princess not dying right away and Yamato joining the fight, but it's all bogged down by a storm of negatives. For Operation MI, I'd like to introduce Operation NP, Operation Nitpick. Now, if I may. This fight is the premier example of Abyssals being faceless enemies. A lot of the fight is the ship girls shooting down a stationary target, and the final boss of Airfield Princess does basically nothing except for taking gunpowder showers. Akagi almost dying has very little impact. Not only was this foreshadowed too much, but I also figured that the anime wouldn't have the balls to kill Akagi because if they did, Fubuki can't get her hero moment. God save the commander because apparently he could foresee the entire fight. He must have had the script with him the entire time since he orchestrates the classic maneuver of bringing every single character together for the last fight. Who, what, when, where, and why is Taiho? The concept of a time loop that Yamato mentions is beyond pointless because we're at the end of the anime. It could have made for an interesting idea had it been introduced earlier, but there is quite literally no time left for any looping shenanigans. There's more nitpicking that could be done and I wish I could do it honestly, but I've already overdone it. The ending credits are really cute and wholesome, but yeah, the anime as a whole ends very poorly. In episode 3, the anime makes the decision to sink Kisaragi. I didn't expect this because I didn't think Kankai would dare take out anyone's waifu, but Mutsuki's reaction to it are interesting enough to watch. However, the loss of Kisaragi led to no long-term change or consequences outside of a small bit in episode 11, which makes me wonder why they chose to take her out to begin with. Kisaragi is the only casualty in the entire anime if you don't count the Abyssals. I think her death not having any long-term results would have been okay if she was the first in a list of casualties. Once again, I understand why they didn't want to kill off any more ship girls, but I think that even having just a few more taken out could have been a way to add more gravity to the fights. As it is, Kisaragi just stands as the odd one out and makes me question why they go all the way with sinking her instead of saying she was injured but rescued and later brought to Yamato's base or something. Because the fights are hard to care about, Kantai is at its best when it's just being a wholesome slice-of-life anime. There's a few reasons why. There's much more diversity available in slice-of-life scenarios than with ship girl battles, at least in the way it's presented in this anime. It's also the best way that the anime can introduce new characters into the mix, expand upon previous characters, and try out different combinations of characters to see what chemistry forms. Lastly, and most importantly, the anime doesn't need to bother with putting on a serious facade. The best example that combines all of this is Episode 6, which was my favorite episode. Episode 6 takes on Destroyer Division 6, who have been very unimportant characters so far, and expands upon them around a very simple theme of a curry competition. It both expands upon characters we've already seen in Division 6 and a little bit with Nagato. It also tries out new combinations of characters by putting them alongside the Kongo sisters and the teachers Ashigara and Haguro. Because of the anime's lighthearted tone, any fan service that pops up doesn't interrupt anything either, since it's just a continuation of the silliness that's been happening the whole time. Even though this episode doesn't break away drastically from any of the other problems, such as characters being stuck in their dedicated mold of a single quirk, this was still my favorite episode because I think it perfectly encapsulates what the anime should have done more of. Other similarly good bits include the search for Shimakaze in episode 4 and the flagship feud in episode 5. Now feels like the best opportunity to talk about Kantai Collection's issue with timing. Several times throughout the anime, it will go from being really upbeat and wholesome immediately into a serious scene and vice versa. The upbeat and wholesome parts are fine, but constantly bouncing back and forth between those parts and serious parts contributes to taking a lot of weight out of those serious parts. It sometimes even feels like the anime isn't taking the serious parts seriously themselves. Kankai's fanservice is more tame compared to Azure Lane, and most of it comes in the form of the docks, which is apparently fancy naval lingo for the bathhouse. Instead of doing one big fanservice bomb, the anime instead chooses to sprinkle tiny bits and pieces of the docks into its episodes, sometimes even switching in and out of it during another scene. The issue with timing is glaring here because a lot of the times the docks appear, it feels forced and intrusive in a way where it just squats in the middle of another scene's runtime. I think Azure Lane's approach with their bathhouse parts was better in the sense that they were all condensed to one or two big scenes and stayed away from more serious moments. The beach scene does stay out of the way of anything serious, but it still doesn't quite stick the landing because it tries to force some things with Yamato. I said earlier that Azure Lane tried to take itself more seriously, but for Kantai Collection I'm not quite sure. I'd assume that it didn't want to take itself too seriously because that's when I liked the anime. But there was just enough put into the operations and decisions like sinking Kisaragi or destroying the naval base. It makes me think that the anime wanted these parts to be taken with a lot of weight, and as I saw, it didn't really achieve that. I'm certain that I enjoyed Kantai more than I should have, and against my best judgment, I would say that I very cautiously recommend it. Don't take the fights very seriously, and if you want something that is cute and silly every now and then I think the Kantai anime is serviceable in that department. But do take that recommendation with an enormous boulder of salt, because I do have a weak spot for cute things and am quite sure that I'm unknowingly overvaluing the silly and wholesome parts. If you rewind your memory a little bit, you'll recall that there was a yet unstated second reason as to why I enjoyed the Kantai Collection anime more than I did the Azure Lane anime. The second reason is my interpretation of each anime's goals. I thought that Azure Lane wanted to take itself more seriously, so I viewed it under the lenses of those standards, doing the same for Kantai Collection under a light-hearted lens. If I was correct in my assumption that Kantai was not meant to be taken seriously, an assumption I grow increasingly unsure about, then I didn't have a reason to give the serious parts as much consideration and criticism as I did for Azure Lane, since that wasn't the anime's focus. And maybe some people will disagree with that and think that I was just as negative towards Kankai's serious elements. Maybe that's correct, and just like Kantai, my interpretation of my writing could be different than what it actually portrayed. The improvements I've listed out for Azure Lane and Kantai Collection split off in two different directions. Instead of trying to straddle the line of being both very and not very serious, I tried to point each into one direction or the other. However, you'll notice that the suggestions I have for Azure Lane are much more detailed, and that's because the direction I decided to go with these improvements requires that amount of detail. I'll begin with Kantai Collection since I have less to say about it. If Kantai was to be taken down a more lighthearted route, which I personally would have liked, the easiest piece of advice to offer here is to replicate more of what episode 6 did so well. Pick silly, light concepts and choose different combinations of characters each time. Drop the war with the Abyssals and drop Fubuki's story as well, or at the very least tone it down to its silly and wholesome moments to match the rest. If Kanko was to go down a more serious route, then the war with the Abyssals is the way to go. Take the time to properly explain the origins and the motivations of the Abyssals, maybe going as far as exploring inner hierarchies and specific Abyssals. The operations need to take place in a much more diversified set of locations, similar to Azure Lane's decent enough variety, that way these feel more distinct from one another instead of the overall generic feel that they give in the current state of the anime. More stakes need to be added to the fights in one way or another, with the most drastic way being increasing the number of casualties. The most difficult part would be to remove or heavily cut down on the ship girls narrating their battle plans in exchange for more action, while still making the operations understandable for the viewer. For Azure Lane, I stated that there were several smaller but good ideas that were never explored. I think that by simply expanding on a few of them, we have a much better base to work with. The distrust against Akagi and Kaga presented by Shokaku I think needed to be a much bigger focus. Introduce it much earlier in the anime instead of in the last third. Have it initially be brought up to only some of the other carriers such as Zuikaku, Hiryu, and Soryu. Eventually this distrust seeps out and spreads throughout the Sakura Empire, finding its way to Nagato. Nagato would delay Orochi just like she does in the anime currently, which causes a fracture within the Sakura Empire. There would be one side opposing Orochi and Siren influence under the leadership of Nagato, and another side that wants to continue Orochi under the leadership of Akagi and Kaga. There's individual character improvements that could be made out of this as well. Zuikaku, who is fiercely loyal to the 1st Carrier Division, would have a crisis of conscience because now she has to choose between the 1st Carrier Division and her sister Shokaku. Akagi's delusion of resurrecting Amagi could become increasingly desperate as a result of the tensions and affect her relationship with Kaga, and amidst all of the tensions, Ironblood could seize the opportunity to get a piece of Orochi for themselves. By expanding that one idea, we have all of these paths and sub-stories that branch out from it and add these extra layers to the Sakura Empire. I could honestly see myself watching an entire anime based around that storyline, and it's totally not because it was my own idea. That being said, to facilitate all of this, cuts have to be made. I don't think I would mind some time being moved away from the Azure Lane base to the Sakura Empire for this to happen. And as much as I hate saying this, the story with Javelin, Laffy, and Unicorn would also need to be cut down to make room. As far as using currently existing content, I don't think the same level of expansion could be done for Eagle Union, Royal Navy, and Iron Blood, because there isn't anything that is as interesting as the happenings within the Sakura Empire. Lastly, if Azure Lane wanted to go down the lighthearted, more fanservice-y route, then Javelin, Laffy, and Unicorn's story can be kept, if not expanded to properly incorporate Z23 into it as well, instead of just tacking her on at the very end. And to fill in the spaces around that story, I would recommend the same thing I did for Kantai Collection, using their episode 6 as a point of inspiration. Now would be the time to mention that there's a third anime that I haven't talked about. It's not in the title of the video because I wanted to keep quiet on it for as long as possible, but I'm sure someone will inevitably spoil it in the comments. This secret would be the 2 Girls Frontline animated shorts, Healing Chapter and Madness Chapter. These are immediately different from Azure Lane and Kantai Collection in both formatting and direction. Both Healing and Madness Chapter are quick 3-minute shorts that absolutely knew they wanted to be very lighthearted. I think it's important to look at these because the animated shorts display how much difference that commitment to a direction can make. While the execution of the 2 chapters are different, I am very confident in saying that Healing Chapter is one of my favorite things to have ever been animated, and has been so since its release in 2019. And that's coming from someone whose knowledge in Girls Frontline is similar to his knowledge in Kantai Collection. Very little. Madness Chapter is not quite the same, so we'll begin with that since I want to end the video on a positive note. Madness Chapter is based on a series of 4-panel comics, and the pacing is lightning fast. Madness Chapter, with this short runtime, displays several scenes in each episode, with it eventually progressing to a consistent 2 scenes per episode, the second scene being told in multiple parts. I think being unfamiliar with the source material hurt my experience with Madness Chapter greatly. There are many characters flying in and out of each episode, and because of the faster nature, a lot of them boil down into similar traits in order for the humor in each scene to work. There's a lot more direct references to in-game mechanics, with some scenes making these mechanics their sole focal point. These scenes usually left me mostly confused with a vague understanding of the reference. Aside from a few bits that I actually liked quite a bit, a lot of the episodes blend together into a colorful mess that I can't really tell apart, and that's okay. Because of all of the references, I figured that Madness Chapter's intended audience wasn't someone like me who knew very little about Girls Frontline. While I knew very little about Kanko, that anime was much more approachable to me because it never went too overboard with its references. I love Healing Chapter's art style, and I think it perfectly embodies the anime's self-awareness of it wanting to be silly. The first episode even pokes fun at this idea. The cast of characters is extremely limited, and each character is very simple. Each episode in Healing Chapter depicts one self-contained scenario, and rarely does it ever use most of its cast. It doesn't attempt to bite off more than it can chew, and instead knows exactly what it can do and wants to do. There's no attempt to tell any semblance of a story until the very end, so all of the shorts end up being fast, fun bits of fanservice that focus on the characters. Having simplified characters works wonders for this, since Healing Chapter doesn't focus on character development and just throws them into whatever scenarios the writers thought would be hilarious. Forcing a continuous narrative is something that the shorts don't care about, so each episode can wildly differ from one another and give us a lot of variety. And even when the anime does do a small story at the very end, it's a pleasant surprise more than anything, and it still sticks to what made the previous episodes great. In fact, that short story alone is better than a lot of the fights in Azure Lane and Kantai, since there's actual stakes tied to it and not just a bucket load of dialogue. I recognize that there is one fundamental difference that contributed to Healing Chapter's success: the formatting. The episodes can't overstay or overdo anything because there isn't enough time. Unlike my videos, Healing Chapter gets straight to the point, does what it needs to do, and then hops out. If Healing Chapter were to be expanded to the more traditional 12-24 minute episode format, it very much could have fallen for the same trap that Azure Lane and Kantai fell for. If it were to be the case, I think the best way to approach it would have been to emulate Season 1 of Kaguya-sama Love is War. I haven't seen Season 2 yet, so I can't confirm that one. Each episode could contain a handful of mini-episodes that each depict their own scenario, with the occasional continuous set of these that would span an entire episode. Healing Chapter knows exactly what its identity and direction is, and it commits to it in multiple ways that are executed simply but also very nicely. It doesn't try to spread itself too thin and accomplish very little like Azure Lane, or constantly bounce back and forth because it couldn't make up its mind like Kantai Collection. I have to imagine the final version of Healing Chapter was very close to what the studio envisioned it would be from the start. So where does the future lie in anime for Azure Lane, Kantai Collection, and Girls Frontline? Season 2 of Girls Frontline Healing Chapter has been confirmed to come out later this year, and I'm quite looking forward to it. Kantai Collection apparently announced a Season 2 a few years ago, but there seems to have been very little news on it since, although the very little news did mention that there was a studio change in 2019, so the project still seems to be going. Azure Lane's future is the most interesting. In late 2019, Yoastar, the publishers behind Azure Lane, announced Yoastar Pictures, their own animation studio. So far, they have announced an anime adaptation of an Azure Lane 4-panel comic. While they don't have a lot of works under their belt, some of the stuff like the Arknights trailer and the event previews for Skybound Oratorio and Aurora Noctis honestly look really good. I just hope that the 4-panel adaptation takes a few pages out of Healing Chapter's book. I don't envy the position that Azure Lane and Kantai Collection were in. Because of the original games, both the inclusion of serious warfare and fanservice were inevitable when it came to filling out all 12 episodes, and as we saw, it didn't turn out too great for either anime. The next Azure Lane adaptation seems like a good opportunity for a rebound since it already has a source material that knows what direction it wants to take. Things are more up in the air for Kantai Collection though, and I can only hope that the shortcomings I found are something that the new studio is also aware of. I think there's a good opportunity for redemption here for both games, an opportunity that I'm hoping they both use successfully. And please, Yoastar, make an Arknights anime. So, this video is way fucking longer than it has any right to ever be. Originally, it was just going to be Azure Lane, but then I decided to watch Kantai for a reference and sort of comparison, and then I just threw in Girls Frontline while I was at it, so that's why this video both is way bigger than it needs to be and also took longer to make. This was my first time covering, I guess what you could quote-unquote say are bad animes. I tried my best to not go too overboard with the negativity since, like, anyone can shit on a bad anime. I mean, punching down is really easy to do. So I tried not to overindulge in it, but I'm not entirely sure how successful I was in it. I thought I did an okay job at it. I'm hoping to do more of these kinds of videos in the future where I do multiple animes in a single video with the sort of single focal point that ties them all together. In this case, it was my biases and familiarity with the original games. So I have a couple ideas lined up already for the future, but those are for the future, so we'll get to those when we get to those. I already know what I want to watch next, but I'm currently undecided on whether or not to make a video on it. I'm 90% certain it'll happen, but we'll see. So that should be everything. Yeah, that's everything from me for today's video. So thanks for anyone that stuck around all the way to this point to listen to everything. And yeah, thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.